So in the Web 1 module, you'll remember I kind of showed this diagram of all the HTML elements that we can use. These are tags that we can use. To really start off, what we want to do for this project is start to structure our HTML around the layout elements that we need to build the actual look and feel of the site. This works really closely with CSS, and you kind of remember that from Web 1. But specifically, we're going to start to kind of pay attention to the actual layout and design. So what we're really going to be looking at is what are called sectioning tags for the HTML. And if you kind of look at this, they're really called semantic elements. It starts to just slice and dice our website to be able to have these areas that we want to have named correctly. And that's the idea of just semantic markup or elements, is we want to name them as something of what they actually are. So if we have a look at what we're going to make for our website in this module, you can kind of see that based on those semantic elements that we talked about, these guys here that are on the website, if you have a look at like some of those, we can use those to essentially mark up our website in a way that's describing these areas. So I've kind of made this graphic in Illustrator just to kind of show that, about what we're going to call things when we're writing in HTML, our sections. Okay, so if you think about it, there's like kind of two main groups here that we're going to work with to start off with. We have a header, and then we have this main area, right? And then inside of those, we're going to have something that are called parent and children, and later when we do a little bit of something called flexbox, you're going to hear things called containers and items. And that's really what we're going to kind of be thinking about. So the red would be the container, and then the green ends up being our items. And that's later down in a couple videos after this when we talk about Flexbox. So you'll hear that again. But in the header, for now, what we're going to have is just this navigation that's inside the header. So it's enclosed inside the header. And same with a division and a footer. Now division is something that used to be used a lot more, and it's not on that list of semantic markup, but we're going to use it just so you can kind of see that this is another one that you can use to kind of describe an area that helps with sectioning. So we have this main that has a division and a footer, and inside that division we are going to have an article, which is essentially all of our text, and then that aside that's going to have our image and our download button. So you can kind of see that that's what we got here. Okay, so we're going to kind of walk through this. So to start off with, we're going to put the header and main in there in our HTML. So we're going to switch back over to brackets, and I'll kind of flip back and forth between those so you can kind of see where we're at. Now I'm going to actually turn off split view just so we're looking at the HTML, because we're really not doing anything with CSS right now. Okay, so the things we need to work on, okay, is inside the body we have our H1 with our name and a link. So right now that's the only thing we have for our header, and so we're going to put a tag called header, open and close around our H1, and this is where we're going to start to be aware of how we format our HTML and CSS. If we add a tab in here, it makes it a whole lot easier to find things. So it takes a little bit more time and organization, but it helps in the long run. For now, we're going to leave it there. The next one we're going to add is that main, right? So we have the main section that's really going to end all the way around our main content, right? So if we take a look at that, we have our header around the top part, and then the main around pretty much everything else. And if we kind of refer to my little graphic here, we have the header that's going to have our name, and then we're going to add the navigation here in a sec. And then the main is going to be the rest of the content. Okay, so we're going to essentially kind of walk through that. Now, one kind of point to make at this point is don't be confused by a header versus the head versus a heading, right? So it can be a little confusing. A heading is a text, the H1 through H6. Header is really just a section of a website, and the head of the document is kind of one of the two main areas for all web pages, the head and the body. So the head is where we're going to put a lot of links to external documents and have metadata for social media and the SEO stuff that you'll talk about later at some point in your major, right? So for now, we're going to keep going. So we're going to add that next part. So we're going to add these green boxes, right? These green sections. So we're going to start with the navigation. Now we don't actually have a navigation of any sort, but there is a nav tag. Gotta spell it right. All right, and we are going to tab over, and right now I'm just going to put a paragraph, and we're going to say the nav will go here. So in a later video, we're going to kind of actually build that specific part out. But for now, we just want to kind of put it in as a placeholder. Okay. If we look at our diagram, we have a div and a footer. So if we kind of jump back in here, inside of our main, we are going to have a div. And this is where we're going to open it and close it around essentially our two columns, our text and then our image, right? So we have hobbies here, so we are going to close that after the hobbies. So this part right here is going to go in our footer. So we're going to go ahead and add that. So footer. Okay. Now you'll notice that I'm kind of like, backspacing and hitting some tabs here. Again, this is just going to help you organize it as you move forward and make it a whole lot easier to read, right? So when we go back into our HTML, we can find things a lot faster. Okay, so use your tabs and spacing and everything. And there's nothing wrong with putting extra space in between elements as well. Okay, so we got everything going here, and we are going to go back to our little diagram. I'm going to turn on this last part, and here's where we just get kind of our two columns. So we're going to have an article around the text, and we're going to have a side around the picture. Okay, so in our HTML right now, we have the image first, so we actually need to add the aside at the top around our image. We're going to add that download button later. And again, tabbing things over so I can find things easier later on. And then the main content area, this is where I'm going to have something called an article. So open, and then I'm going to close that essentially right before the close of the division. And you'll notice that actually when I'm doing this, when I'm cutting out the close, you see the red. If you ever see red in brackets, that's usually pointing to something that's wrong, right? So that's when you want to kind of pay attention to things, right? And then when you put it back in there, it's all good. So I'm going to tab this over one more. I'm going to select this part, and I'm just hitting tab on the keyboard, right? So we have tabs in there so we can read things, makes it a whole lot easier, and we're kind of getting all the sectioning set up here. Now later on, we're going to kind of control this with Flexbox, like I said, to make it actually look like things. And if we actually look at this in Chrome when we test it, you're not going to see a whole lot of change from what you've already been seeing, right? These are really just to help you set up what we're going to do with CSS later. So it literally is just kind of labeling things, and that's what semantic markup is. We want to label things correctly so that way it's describing what it's around, and then when we style it, it makes it a whole lot easier. And there's some other stuff that it helps with as well. If you really get into this, there's more to it than just what we're talking about right now in terms of site structure and page structure. But this will kind of get us going with the rest of the project here. So back in the HTML, I'm just going to kind of give a quick look over, make sure my tabs are okay so I can read this easier later on. I'm going to tab this guy over. I'm actually going to tab the footer over just because technically that main is my main section, and then the header, right? Now you don't have to get too, there's no like check on this, but the reason that's important, obviously it's easier to read later on, But if you do get into this, or you do start working on teams when you're building websites or apps or anything with code, they're really going to love you for tabbing things over, because it makes it easier for other people to read and find things as well. Okay, now the very last thing, don't forget to file and save, or Apple S, Control S if you're on a PC, and we should be good.